Hello and welcome to the Antiquities Coalition webinar on issues and heritage. We're so delighted to have you all joining us for what promises to be a very interesting discussion about how culture can be part of the post-COVID-19 economic recovery. I'm Deborah Lair. I'm the moderator of today's discussion and the chairman of the Antiquities Coalition. The COVID-19 pandemic is more than just a health crisis. It's exacting a human and financial toll that is unprecedented. The arts and culture have not been spared. In the United States alone, the industry has already lost an estimated $5 billion, and that's increasing by $33 million each day that we're quarantined. But as governments consider how to rebuild their economies in the wake of COVID-19, it's critical that they view the arts and culture sector not as a philanthropic endeavor or as a drain on the economy, but instead as the economic engine that it could be. Museums alone contribute $50 billion towards the US economy and $12 billion in tax revenue every year, while all arts and culture contribute over $875 billion a year to the economy, almost 5% of GDP. Those are very interesting statistics, but here's another one that's really fascinating. More people visit museums every year than attend all sports events combined, not just one. That's a pretty amazing statistic. And while this value goes way beyond dollars, it goes into a world that now is starved for human content, for education, and for entertainment. Cultural heritage is needed more than ever in this quarantine time. Today, we've gathered some of the leading experts, really giants in the field, to discuss these issues. Bonnie Burnham, who is the president and founder of the Cultural Heritage Finance Alliance and led the World Monuments Fund from 1985 to 2015, where she really transformed the organization and presently is the president emerita. We're very pleased, Bonnie, that you're able to join us. Dr. Richard Curran, who is the Smithsonian Distinguished Scholar and Ambassador at Large. He's had a very incredible career, has really been a champion around the protection and preservation of cultural heritage, one of my personal heroes for all the work that he's done at the Smithsonian. He was previously the acting provost there and served as the Undersecretary for Museums and Research, as well as the Undersecretary for History, Art, and Culture. Thank you, Dr. Curran. And Donovan Ripkema, who brings a very unique perspective as the president of Heritage Strategies International, an organization that focuses on the intersection between heritage and economic development. And he teaches heritage economics at the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you so much, Dr. Ripkema, for joining us also.
Thank you.
Today, we're going to explore the important role that culture plays, more than just a focus on museums, but heritage tourism, heritage sites, archaeology, antiquities stores, what they play in the economy and how they can contribute to an economic relief program as the US government and as other governments look to how to get our economy started again. We'll be having a discussion with our panelists. We welcome your thoughts and contributions through the chat function. We'll be monitoring it. So please send them in. Don't hesitate if you have questions for our group. This is being recorded and will also be posted on the Antiquities Coalition website after this event. So Richard, let me start with you. Please give us a sense of what the range of culture is and why it's important that we focus on it at this time.
Well, I speak as an anthropologist, and it's a dangerous question for an anthropologist because we've been arguing for a long time about how to define culture. But maybe in a simple way, it's the record of collective human achievement and creativity. And it's embodied in our artworks, in our artifacts, our sites, but it's also embodied in our beliefs, in our stories. Culture, very simply, is what gives society and human beings meaning. And it distinguishes us from other species. It's always important, particularly in times of crisis, when our beliefs, our values, our sense of self and identity, our community are threatened, and we wonder about its future. And so often it's times when, in tough times, and I've experienced a lot of disasters, human conflicts and natural disasters, where when they strike, that's not the time that culture like flitters away and is regarded as just entertainment or just so stories. In fact, that's when culture is the most. When people face crisis, that's when they pray the hardest. When people face crisis, it's when they think about their family and their bonds to others in the most meaningful way. And so culture is not something added on to things, but goes to the very core of how we survive and recover from them.
Yeah. Well, that's really important. And so clearly it has much more than a dollar value. And Donovan, I think that really has been reflected in some of the work that you do. You've talked about the importance of historic preservation and what it means in city centers, and that these historic sites become, quite honestly, as you've pointed out, places for thought leadership, whether it's in technology or in the artist community. Can you talk a little bit about the work that you've been doing in that context, please?
Sure. Well, it really does. In the kind of economics geek talk, there's a concept called revealed preference. And that is, we could have a poll and raise our hand, yay or nay, on any given issue. But the other way we could determine that is simply how we act in the marketplace. That's our revealed preference. And what has happened in a dozen studies that we've done in cities around the US and elsewhere is that there is a revealed preference to be in historic buildings, historic districts by a particular group of interests, of economic sectors. One of them is the arts, entertainment, and cultural sector, the kind of creative class, has a revealed preference that there will be a disproportionate share of those businesses. And again, this is in the kind of private sector, not the institutional side, of being in historic districts. It's also true of knowledge workers, have a revealed preference, the businesses and therefore their employees to be in those areas. It's also a preference of small businesses, startup businesses, young businesses. And what's interesting about those combinations is that not only are they have a preference to be in historic neighborhoods, historic buildings, but they're also among the sectors that are being most strategically damaged in this whole chaos we're in.
That's right. So that's very interesting. So that's something as mayors consider what their plan is, clearly a focus on the historic city centers as a means of attracting innovation also could be very important. So Bonnie, in your new role, you've been looking at how market mechanisms can help, how we can move beyond a philanthropic model supporting arts and culture and really looking at how potentially can become an attractive investment, which is a very smart, very cutting edge work. How do you see this opportunity coming out of sort of this post-COVID-19 world?
Thank you, Deborah. I'm happy to talk on behalf of the Cultural Heritage Finance Alliance, and thank you for having me. I think we've established between us, and we'll continue to talk about how the resources that are available for heritage preservation and for cultural institutions are inadequate. And they're based on a model that goes back probably 100 years of combining government support and government ownership of these assets in a very significant way with the growth of philanthropy, particularly in America, but now across the world. Philanthropy supports government in supporting culture and making these vital industries work. But there's been a lot of disinvestment in the heritage world in inner cities. This is something that the National Trust for Historic Preservation in America has worked on for decades. In other countries, the problem is probably more intense and really follows the ups and downs and booms and busts of economic life. And so this is an issue that I began looking at a couple of years ago when I retired from the World Monuments Fund. We're seeing, obviously, a huge exacerbated problem as a result of the COVID epidemic. And the institutions and small businesses that will be impacted, as has already been said, are the ones that are the biggest users of our cultural spaces. But there's a bigger problem, and it's reflected in the Sustainable Development Goals that were adopted by the UN in 2015 with a 2030 target. There's a whole group of integrated social goals that will lead us to a place, in principle, if we can realize them, that will prevent a global health catastrophe that we've just begun to have a little bit of a taste of in the last couple of months, as a result of the 2-degree centigrade temperature rise and the impacts of global warming. And so every sector really needs to work together in order to achieve these goals. They range from poverty alleviation to eradication of disease, agricultural goals, sustainable consumption, environment. It's a kind of united theory of sustainability. And heritage is in the mix for the first time. It was not in the mix of the Millennium Goals. So this sector's worked very hard to bring culture more into the mainstream. And I think that cultural heritage can be the nexus of planning for the future of the communities that we want. There are also new kinds of financial resources in the mix as a result of the Sustainable Development Goals, and a lot of investment in microfinance, in healthcare solutions, in poverty alleviation. But we haven't seen private finance embracing culture, and I don't think we've made enough of an effort to reach out to them. And so that's the challenge that I'm trying to address now. First, by looking at case histories of successful projects that have been carried out in the last couple of decades, like the work of the World Bank in Fez in Morocco, or the Aga Khan in Cairo, or the work that the World Monuments Fund did after the Soviet period in Eastern and Central Europe. I think these are great case histories that will lead us to a kind of methodology where we can reach a broader spectrum of investment in the future of heritage. What's referred to these days, the buzzword is blended finance, bringing together a range of capital sources to address the needs of society. And we want to make sure that heritage is in that mix. But there is an issue. There hasn't been much recording of impacts by our sector. And when impact investors look at a potential project, they want to know in very concrete terms, both economic and social and environmental terms, what kind of impacts those investments are going to have. And they're looking for impact value as an alternative for economic return on investment. So I think this is the great opportunity in front of us. We're reaching out to other organizations that are involved in the heritage sector around the world and asking them to help us identify not only case studies, but pilot projects that we will be able to put together as a portfolio and see if we can find investment.
Great. Well, Bonnie, I think that's incredibly important work. And, you hate to think that there can be some benefit coming out of such a disaster here, but maybe it is creative thinking around how to use market mechanisms to better support heritage and culture. And certainly in the case of the World Bank, we've seen them being very creative in the type of cultural of bond issuances that they've come up with. Even before COVID-19, they had come out with a pandemic bond. They're helping in the Amazon through reforestation bonds. And I think this is the kind of thing, if you can get multilateral institutions interested to help cover some of the risk and find these good investments, there are opportunities really to be very creative in whether it's impact investing, social investing, or following the models that we've seen in climate change, how there was initial government policy and financial support, and it's hit a tipping point where the private sector really has jumped into it. Richard, I'd like to turn to you on this subject because the Department of Commerce actually has published some very interesting statistics, and they say that heritage visitors consistently, whether in the United States or globally, but particularly they've been tracking, obviously, these numbers for the United States, outstay and outspend any other types of visitors. And I think you have firsthand experience with that at the Smithsonian. What have you seen in terms of visitors? What kind of visits do you get at the Smithsonian?
Well, Washington draws about 20 million visits a year from outside the area. And we get most of them at the Smithsonian. Studies over a long period of time have shown that, people, first, either they're coming because they want to visit the museums and they want to visit the memorials and the monuments, Arlington Cemetery, the various sites. And so it's a kind of civic tourism, if you will, in coming to Washington, and the Smithsonian is at a center of it. That said, we find even for business travel, what happens is people are doing business. They're doing business on a Wednesday or Thursday, and they'll stay over for a Friday and Saturday and Sunday. Or people will be coming for business, and they might bring a spouse or a family to enjoy a holiday weekend that they're going into. So it has some consequence beyond even for business travelers who are taking advantage of the museums. Of course, that generates a huge amount of money to the local economy. Now, the last study I did, I think it was done by Stephen Fuller years ago, and estimated about $6 or $7 billion that the Smithsonian generated into the DC area economy. Well, I think that study is at least 10 years, maybe 15 years old. So double that figure. And, when one thinks of cultural tourism, really broadly in terms of the arts, I mean, my hometown, New York City. I mean, it's wonderful to go visit the stock market. It's wonderful to go visit the big accounting firms and the financial investors and so on. But, millions, tens of millions of people go because they want to see the Statue of Liberty, or they, want to go to shows on Broadway. Or they want to visit, historic neighborhoods and so on. Same thing with Paris internationally, or London, or take your pick. So, it's kind of amazing sometimes to try to justify the cultural sector in that world. And as Bonnie and Donovan point out, as you point out, Deborah, the cultural and artistic sector has to pay for itself. It has to figure out some way of financing it. People who are part of symphony orchestras or actors or curators have to get paid. People have to, you have to figure out how to finance it. But as we look to the cultural economy in the United States and around the world, we kind of have to justify, well, culture is important to serve. And, I look at the airline industry. Now, the airline industry in the CARES Act got $12 billion of subsidy. That's for people to keep flying, to get on airplanes. To go where? For what? There's almost an assumption that, oh, well, that's to take them to Orlando, or that's to take them to, national parks, or that's to take people internationally to go somewhere to see something. If you take culture and the arts out of the equation, there ain't nothing to see. and hotels, airplanes, restaurants, all those things we think of as the vibrant economy in any city of any size just disappears. And so my sense is that, and Bonnie's right, it's been hard to justify in those kind of really impact terms sometimes the impact of culture, arts, and heritage on the economy, but remove it and you remove a large base of the economy of many places around the planet.
Yeah. Well, I think, Donovan, in your work, you've been citing, I think, a very specific example in St. Augustine, Florida. There really, the numbers that you had there were very impressive and really kind of a good example of the role that historic preservation and heritage can play.
Well, yeah, we just finished a study actually on the climate change issue to kind of evaluate the value of the heritage assets that are at risk with sea level rise. But as part of that, we looked at the tourism attendance. About 55% of the tourists that go to St. Augustine, America's oldest city, would be broadly categorized in the heritage category. But the spending is gargantuan, is that $1.6 million every day are spent in this town with 33,000 people by not the whole tourism sector, just the heritage portion of the tourism sector in St. Augustine. And that translates into $900,000 a day in paychecks for people working in St. Augustine. Again, this spin-off stuff that Richard just mentioned. So it's somebody taking tickets at a historic site, but it's somebody working in a restaurant or in a clothing store where they do retail purchases or driving a taxi. So it's this huge impact that's very specifically driven out of the heritage visitors. And you're absolutely right about this disproportionate contribution to the local economy. The Commerce Department numbers that you cited, yeah, people stay longer, they spend more per day, and then importantly, they also visit more places during their stay. And so that one heritage visitor, in fact, has a much greater local impact than does tourism in general, kind of wherever it exists.
And it's a major export for the United States as well. I mean, it's one area where we actually don't have a deficit. We're exporting more in cultural goods and services than we're importing. And so that's another great opportunity. I think, Bonnie, what do you see as some of the challenges of making this transition, of attracting more private sector capital?
I think that one of the biggest challenges is actually the reluctance of the public sector to bring private finance into heritage, and the lack of history of that kind of interaction. So constructing these partnerships is important, it's challenging, and the private sector needs to know that it's insulated from risk. And that's the critical role that the public sector can play by guaranteeing return on investment through essentially leveraging current work against future tax revenues. And this is the way the heritage sector works very successfully in America through tax incentive financing. But it's also a standard operating procedure for the environmental sector. They've been able to persuade governments that investing in resources like managing forests and fisheries and things like that will generate economic activity in the future, and therefore they're willing to back up an investor position. That needs to happen in the heritage sector.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have a question for each of you as we talk about all these different aspects and the multiplier effect that heritage can have on both a local economy, but the national economy overall. Should we have more of a policy, a coordinated policy focus? Should we be, again, raising this issue of creating perhaps a Department of Culture, or at least having an undersecretary of culture, not like at state currently, where the focus is more on this in the context of soft power and being combined with educational exchanges and what our profession is, but something that is dedicated just to the heritage space that covers the broad range of economic, social, and other ishes. Richard, why don't I put you on the spot?
I'm laughing because I've been part of the discussions over the years, and remember a good friend of mine, Bill Ivey, when he became chair of the National Endowment of the Arts. Bill and I had many debates over this issue, and there's some kind of philosophical things about it. On one hand, kind of where to locate it and where to put it, and so. And whether Americans
couldn't be like a small, like the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House. You have
there is on the books a Federal Coordinating Council for Culture, and so you do. It hasn't met much, but you have the head of the Smithsonian, the head of the Library of Congress, the endowments, and so on. And there are various mechanisms. There's been the President's Committee for the Arts and Humanities. I've served as a Smithsonian liaison to. That's now not operating, but under periods, under the Bushes, under the Obamas, that was very vigorous. Under the Clintons, that helped lead the Save America's Treasures program for the millennium that pumped hundreds of millions of dollars. Talk about a program that pumped hundreds of millions of dollars into the economy, taking government matching funds and making the case to communities around this country that somehow restoring that place that was important in the development of women's rights, or restoring that old adobe church in New Mexico, or restoring that old rail car in Pennsylvania, somehow would attract investment and activity, and therefore be worth saving our heritage because it was saving America's history, our soul, our spirit. So, you know, there have been times when we've been able to achieve it. The amazing thing about the United States, and this may be changing, as Bonnie notes, with international philanthropy as well, is the U.S. cultural sector is pretty much the Wild West. Many governments regulate museums, performing arts venues, and indeed cultural expression in terms of the airwaves, in terms of production houses. It's government regulated. And Americans, I think, would rebel against that. We like that freedom to create. We like that diversity of creativity. So that spawns a lot of activity. It also means that you have a less coordinated policy to it. I think the ideas of bringing together some of that personal entrepreneurship, business community, arts groups, nonprofits, advocates, and so on is a very interesting mix. It's a mix that's proved very potent in terms of its cultural creativity over time in America. But I don't think we cannot be accused of being overly coordinated in this sphere.
Right. And particularly when there's a crisis. I mean, that's when it really shows, because you don't have the kind of coordinated response that if you had a department that was dedicated to this that could. In fact, Donovan and Bonnie, I want to hear your thoughts, but we also have one question from the listeners about what should the federal government role be in job support for cultural workers. And so that kind of plays into it. It's, you know, you have to apply on your own through the program, or if you have a major lobbying capability, you can go up to the Hill and try and get part of the relief package. Donovan or Bonnie, thoughts on?
Well, I'll take two, and you're both, what you just said and what Richard said, I think, germane. There is in Europe a thing called the European Heads of Heritage Forum. It's basically the culture ministers across the spectrum. And in the Great Recession in the late 2000s, in fact, that group of basically culture ministers played a great role of making sure that cultural activities, broadly written, were part of the stimulus package that they had as coming out of the recession. And there was no such thing in the U.S. stimulus plan. There was in the European, because almost every country had a ministry of culture or some equivalent, and they got together and they influenced policy directly. The second example, you may or may not like it as an example, but again, in response to economics, is that the Saudis right now are in the process of creating a ministry of culture, kind of raising culture out of the tourism department and moving it up as really a very conscious part of the economic diversity effort going on in Saudi Arabia, saying we can't live on oil forever, we have to diversify our economy, and kind of at the top of their priorities is a culture ministry. And so there's all of Europe, and then a Middle Eastern country that, in fact, I would suggest ought to be here in the US, we ought to be looking at them for examples.
I'd like to add a couple of comments. First of all, the government has taken a very vigorous lead in some other sectors. For example, the Paycheck Protection Plan that's helping small businesses and small cultural institutions to survive through this period. And on top of that, in the community development world, for example, there are foundations coming in now and putting big resources in the hands of the CDFIs, the community development entities, in order to provide even more of a safety net for these small businesses that are trying to reopen and are not getting the kind of support that the bigger businesses are. And something like this for the cultural sector would specifically designed for cultural institutions would be fantastic, because there's already a network in place that would allow money to be injected through things like local revolving funds and the nonprofit finance funds that exist across the country. And the fact that we don't have strong advocates in our government for culture would make it harder for something like that to happen. Even though I think that the experience, the American experience, and particularly the vitality of the philanthropic community and the nonprofit sector is a model for the rest of the world and the model that everyone would like to be able to follow. But I also want to mention the Marshall Plan, and let's not forget what happened after World War II when money from the United States paid for the reconstruction of countries across the world in the post-war era. And a lot of that money went to cultural reconstruction and heritage reconstruction. And if it hadn't happened, it wouldn't have created that precedent that we have in Europe today of strong support and financial investment in culture as one of the anchors or pillars of community.
Yeah, one of the problems we have, I think, with financing the whole, if you take the kind of heritage, culture, arts sector, is the feedback loop between investment and return. So, if you take a look at museums, the American Art Museum's directors in their survey, I think, of the top 200 art museums in the United States, find that it costs an average of about $60 or $70 a museum visit. Science museums and centers are less cost, down about $30, $35, but the price of admission is nowhere near that amount. And so you're ending up subsidizing all sorts of institutions at the front end, yet we enjoy the benefits at the back end. So we love these, they're around because they generate crowds, they generate activity, people want to live near them. Talk about Saudi. I mean, talk about, the UAE, with building the Louvre Abu Dhabi and all these other museums. It's a very conscious choice to build cultural attractions that will entice people to buy housing, to locate there, and to develop the businesses there. So I think right now there is an ask, some museums and other organizations have taken advantage of the PPP. There are other programs that they're taking advantage of. There's right now an ask from the museum community for about $6 billion to be added to the IMLS budget, which is about, kind of 30 times their annual budget. But the idea is to inject that amount. Deborah, you cited a figure of $5 billion lost already in that sector. And the idea is to help make up for it, because if you lose these organizations at the front end, it's very hard to get them back. Yeah. It's very hard to build up and recover these institutions, and you will have lost a tremendous investment that's gone into them over time, whether that be of private philanthropy, of foundation grants, of all sorts of activity, of government support. And right now, I think the American Alliance of Museums is estimating that it may be somewhere in that 30%, maybe up to 40% of museums around the United States will not be able to reopen after this crisis. That is right.
But there's a point though that both Richard and Bonnie brought up, and that is the economic values of culture are one of the values, but they're not all of the values. So we may lose $65 an attendee at an art museum, but if you only measure it by the economic return, it's a stupid idea to have art museums. Well, is it? Of course it isn't. So yeah. It's not, and I'm not unapologetic by we measure mostly economic things, but that doesn't mean that's the only thing that could be measured, and we just have to be more proficient at layering these other kinds of values, the return that we are getting that simply aren't monetized in terms of dollar equivalent.
Right. Sure, Donovan. Look, that would be a good argument. I mean, if you were looking at economic value and straightforward profit and loss, why would you have elementary schools?
Well, exactly right.
Middle schools or high schools or any of these things? So
But that's where a lot of debate has been going. I mean, in other sectors, and hopefully we can learn from some of the models there. I mean, the whole climate change issue, it's a lot of this is, you know, predicting future economic losses, and then how do you start to plan for those? And so there's been a lot of progress in that area. And the reason I brought up this bond concept is because I know at one point the IFC was considering this concept of cultural bonds and finding big investors who are willing to take a chance. If you get the international financial institutions who are willing, the multilateral banks or others, to underwrite some of the risk, you can start to develop that as a model. And this is, I think, the kind of creative thinking that we need to have coming out of this crisis, is people look at how to invest in things that in the short term may not be a sure economic bet, but in the long term with a multiplier effect, they're a very good economic bet. I mean, this was even the debate about investing in women at one point, whether it was, but it turns out that the multiplier effect of giving a woman $1 is much more significant than giving a man $1. So, you know, this is the evolution of thinking. We're starting to get some questions too from our audience. I don't know if anybody wants to say anything on those topics before we go. Richard, it looked like you were going to say something too.
Well, I was just going to say, you know, it's the long-term versus short-term, and indeed we're paying for it right now. I mean, if you look at these pandemics, you know, we think of these as like all of a sudden they come out of nowhere. Well, they don't come out of nowhere. In fact, there's been a good, healthy group of organizations, my colleagues at the Smithsonian, but people in various universities, health organizations, and around the world, who've looked at zoonotic diseases. Right now, there's over 1,000 viruses. If this doesn't scare everybody, it should. So right now, folks, scientists are tracking 1,000 different viruses that go from animal species to human species. Why do they do that? Well, they do that because deforestation, desertification, other things, climate change, are reducing wildlife areas and bringing wildlife closer to domestic animals and people. And this is happening around the world. Now, that is really a slow-moving kind of thing. But when you think of the epidemics that we faced, AIDS goes from animals to humans. Ebola, Zika, West Nile, avian flu, and coronavirus. Yeah. And so these things are going to happen. Now, if you had told somebody, you know, like 30 years ago, gee, we need to invest in the environment because it's going to stop, you know, like all these, you know, epidemics, people would look at you a little crazy. Well, maybe now they won't look at you as being so crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. So Michael Zimmerman asked a question about, we were talking support at a national level or an international level. What kinds of things can local communities and universities be doing during this time to support the heritage industry? Donovan? Bonnie?
Well, I think the first, and it's going to take some compromise, both on the part of people who are heritage advocates, but also a broader view of local government officials, is that we need to say, and again, I'm going to narrow it at the moment to the kind of built heritage. We integrate that into a whole wide range of local policy actions. We need to think of heritage conservation as part of our environmental activities, as part of our economic development activities, as part of our job training activities, as part of our tax generation activities, part of our education activities. And so instead of thinking on a local level, here we have, oh, we're doing a good job because we have a heritage commission. We ought to think about that much more horizontally and think about what's the role that heritage plays in the education department, the transportation department, the environmental. We need to, because it has a huge positive impact. We just need to be enlightened about those contributions and see it as a cross-sector contributor.
I agree with that completely. And just as an example, in New York, we have a new law that requires mitigation of environmental damage by a retrofit of existing buildings, which have to be brought up to a zero carbon footprint by 2030. And this is expected to produce billions of dollars of investment in the sector and create about 140,000 jobs. So where is heritage in relation, where are the heritage buildings in relation to that particular program? hasn't really been thought about. And there are potentials that you could lose a lot of quality and quantity of fabric if there aren't special guidelines created for heritage. But it's a great opportunity to see positioning our heritage right at the center of other kinds of activities that are taking place that are supposed to help us realize these environmental targets down the road. So I think that's the answer. It's horizontal. It's organizations working in the field, developing projects that are integrated across sectors and that may involve capital resources beyond which the sector's used to thinking, but will ultimately have very positive impacts. And I think the changes in tourism patterns that are likely to come out of the COVID crisis over the next few years are a great opportunity for communities to rethink their economics and what the impact of unmanaged tourism has been on their communities and how they could deliver something that would be better for the future.
And
Great.
we're seeing this even in internationally. One of the projects we're working on right now is in Mosul, in the Mosul Museum that was destroyed. And as many people know, Mosul is a historic city, as mentioned in the Bible, and ISIS took over for several years and spent a lot of time blowing up the El Nouri Mosque and destroying the museum and archaeological sites, other historic tombs and buildings. And they were very ecumenical in destroying Islamic sites and Christian sites and Jewish sites and Yazidi sites and everybody's sites in an effort to erase history. So here you have heritage in ruin, an absolute ruin. And what we've been seeing is then the rallying around in society, and again, this very kind of horizontal way of saying, okay, well, we have to, rebuild a city, a historic city. And it's not only rebuilding its bricks and mortar, but it's rebuilding its psyche and its spirit and people who were devastated, who were stripped of history, identity, their sense of comedy with each other that they found in those places. And what we've been finding is, students at the university in Mosul, for example, have been great. So you have students who aspire to be engineers. Well, now you have to engineer a 500-year-old structure. That's pretty challenging and pretty interesting. You have architects who are thinking about how do we build anew in a place that's suffered such devastation. You have social scientists and people in the arts and humanities, people in the digital sciences and technology, trying to recreate facsimiles of artifacts that were destroyed irreparably. So, it's really attracted a lot of young people. So we think sometimes, and look at this panel, not all of us, but a lot of us are on the older side of the mean. But here are young, and so we're interested in heritage, but here you have young people reclaiming and rebuilding their heritage once anew. And I think that's a human story. Heritage is not just something that's passed down from one generation to another. It's passed down and then made one's own and kind of rebuilt and reformulated, rediscovered, and reimagined by a next generation. And that's
right.
In the height of a worst crisis you can imagine on the planet, in Mosul, that is happening among young people. It's really inspirational.
Great.
There have been so many of these inspiring stories over the last 20 years or so. Angkor, for example, and the emblematic role it played in the recovery of Cambodia and the way that people made it their rallying point. It even has appeared on every national flag of Cambodia since the end of the colonial period. And that's the great monuments tend to generate that kind of response. But I think that the cultural sector in general can engage communities to a much greater degree using those same prototypes.
Well, and that's a very good question. We have a question from Douglas Comer about that the panel makes a strong case for the economic benefits associated with heritage. How can we more effectively bring this case to the general public. And I think then that really is bringing a lot more facts to having the case studies, making the economic and the other intangible benefits. I mean, we've seen a lot of pilot projects going on in China, quite honestly, who've been doing some very interesting things around heritage, where in one case there's a real estate developer who is interested in developing a site around a beautiful piece of land on a lake. But there was a historic Hui village, minority village. And so he worked out a deal with a long-term lease on the village, worked with the villagers to restore it, and set up a fund where a percentage of the tourist revenues then would go to the villagers. Some would go into a fund for the restoration and upkeep of the facility, and some would go to the local authorities. And in return, he could develop and create a hotel for the visitors who were coming then to visit the site. And he was creating a leisure facility. They started with about 15,000 visitors, and within, I think it was 3 years, they had 2 million, and now they're up to 15 million. So China is a whole other set of magnitude when you're talking about these kinds of projects, but as a case study, it's a very interesting example. Before I turn to the panel on that question, though, I want to go to our first poll that we did. We asked about, when do you plan on returning to a museum or similar arts venue? As soon as they open was 33%, and 1 to 3 months after opening was 49%. 6 months, 5%, and actually not until there was a vaccine or reliable treatment was 14%. So that was interesting in terms of the poll results.
That mirrors there's a number of surveys going on within the museum community, and that kind of actually the audience for this is a little more optimistic, I think. About 5% more optimistic than the general public has been on those other surveys.
Right. Thoughts on case studies? Donovan, I know you've also done a lot of work in this area. Bonnie, you said you were working on pilot projects. How do we create a more facts-based argument?
Well, I think there's 2 pieces to that, 3 pieces to that. One is, for a long time, including here in the United States, but still in lots of parts of the world, there was the feeling that culture in general and heritage in particular was just so important and so laden with values that even to talk about it in monetary terms was somehow some evil thing. Well, we got to get over that. We got to get over that. It doesn't mean that I've argued all the time, although my little niche is in the economic side of all of the values of preservation, the economic one is the least valuable. But over the long term, we got to figure out how to quantify those other kinds of values and put them in the mix. But we can't kind of close our eyes and pretend that the economic side doesn't happen. So number one, us preservationists, heritage conservation, got to get over it, thinking that we can't talk about money in this regard. But the second is the commitment to do robust, defensible, hard studies. To look at stuff. We can't just say, oh, everybody loves gargoyles, ergo we save the cathedral. We got to have some demonstrable, quantifiable evidence and be willing to, in fact, commission that.
And Donovan, I think a question has just come up that I think is appropriate for you here, saying that the UK, that in addition to looking at the economic benefits, we should look at the environmental benefits. The UK had done some research to estimate the benefits of restoration versus new building for the carbon footprints, but how do you then look at the environmental issue? I know you've looked at this and had some very interesting statistics about new build versus old build. And how do we encourage more cross-cutting research on this topic?
It has to be. And in fact, that is the area that in the last 3 or 4 years, there's been a lot of expansion of looking at the environmental impact of heritage buildings. But I'll give you a couple of quick ones, kind of back of the envelope calculations. We take forget a monument, take a small 2-story 1890s commercial building in a downtown. It's 25 feet wide, it's 100 feet deep, and it's 2 stories. It's just a piece of kind of pedestrian, but part of everybody's downtown. You tear that building down and throw it away, you have wiped out the environmental impact on the landfill of the last 1,340,000 aluminum cans that we've recycled. Now we've all decided, hey, we need to recycle cans, but with indifference we throw away historic buildings. That's number one. Number two is Bonnie just talked about the what's happening, kind of new requirements in New York City. Well, one of them that came in the Bloomberg administration was measuring. He wanted to set the city on the path to be the most environmentally responsible city in the world. So he said, we've got to start saying who's using the electricity, who's using the power. In fact, the least energy consumptive were the oldest of buildings. Every generation of buildings in New York City, in fact, uses more energy than earlier ones. So we need to kind of do more to evidence all of that.
Bonnie, did you have any?
Well, I just think that both governments and organizations that manage historic properties need to put more resources into research that quantify impacts, and not only economic impacts. There have been great studies on the impact of culture on certain cities and how much money it brings in, but the way that culture relates to community, how cultural attractions are used by local people, what it brings to their lives, how many jobs it provides, all of that really needs to be tracked and factored into projects when they start up. Otherwise, we'll never reach the place where environmentalists are today, where they can quantify in very specific terms how managing a forest will prevent future fires and result in a better ecosystem 25 years down the road. And when they can do that, they're getting the financing that they need from a combination of public and private sources.
Yeah, and they're doing a lot of work now, and I think in the climate area, it's sort of the cutting edge research is how do you start to put a price around natural resources? So how do you put a price on not cutting down the forest because of the forest's role in carbon capture or in not destroying a wetland in the management of floods versus building a dam. So if we can start looking creatively like that in the context of culture and how we start to put numbers and use algorithms and things like that around quantifying the additional benefits that come and looking whether it's sustainability or it's the tourism or it's the social impact in a community or it's the creativity that comes from preserving a historic site, and you get the artists and the innovators who come in, as you were talking about, Donovan, that they prefer to be in a historic site. I think there's a lot of interesting opportunity there. I'd like to, as we start to wind down, also ask our panelists about, as they look ahead, if they were making recommendations, whether it's for the role, making recommendations to the government or to the Congress about what they should be considering in the context of a recovery. What is it that you would be recommending?
Well, I'll go first because our firm has written a little white paper about what will be included in the next stimulus plan. And again, it's going to take some compromise on the part of preservationists. But there's another crisis before this pandemic that's been going on for a long time in the US, and that's the affordable housing crisis. Mm-hmm. Huge, huge problem in every county in America. Well, a disproportionate share of affordable housing provided, not because of some subsidy or public housing or something else, simply because it's in the market, is housing built prior to 1960. Now, all of it isn't historic, it shouldn't be designated, but there's this huge share of what's being provided. Something like 26 of all Americans live in housing built before 1960, and a disproportionate share of that is people who need help in housing. So central core, if I were the czar of the stimulus plan, I'd say that we need to take a huge amount of money and invest it in older housing stock in the United States to simultaneously address employment needs, affordable housing needs, and in many cases, the historic resources of every community. That'd be the top of my list.
Richard?
Well, I would say one, in terms of the cultural infrastructure we have in the country right now, there's too much to be lost if it's not supported. So there's an ameliorative, basically it's money and terms and support that will help institutions get through the short term so they could prosper in the long term. The one of the things I think the crisis has exposed is, how can we deliver experiences digitally?
Yeah.
And I think we find ourselves, one, in a very primitive state. We're not very good at it when it really comes to it, in terms of feeling viscerally like, I'm in a historic site, or I'm really in a museum, or I'm in a theater performance, so I think there's an investment to be done. It's exposed a lot of accessibility issues. And while a lot of middle-class kids with computers and technology have access to it, it's also exacerbated the differences in society and disparities in society of people access to our cultural resources. And so I think we need a kind of investment both on the creative side and on the accessibility side in being able to distribute and involve in a participatory way a broader and greater part of the population in our cultural activities.
Great. And I'm glad you raised that, because we've had several questions from the audience about in this environment, the fact that cultural institutions have had to go more online, and are there opportunities that come out of that? One is it would make it more accessible to people, assuming that they have access to computers and to the internet.
Yeah.
But is this something that cultural institutions should be considering? Because traditionally they're usually to be experienced in person.
Right. Yeah, typically, cultural institutions will spend 95% of their budget or 98% of their budget on their physical presence, and a few percent that they could, kind of get a grant, or they could squirrel away some money, and you got a, 18-year-old who says, well, I could develop this kind of thing for you, and, do that. And yet, I know at the Smithsonian, as we look at it, we serve about 30 million visits a year. 30 million, it's a huge number. But really, there's 300 million other Americans that we're not serving every year, and there's billions of people across the planet. So how can we devote more resources to provide a kind of experience that's meaningful to those other 99.8% of the people who we should be serving?
I was going to say that communities are going to have to rethink tourism and really focus on those cultural tourists who are interested in the deeper experience, who are the bigger spenders and who have less of a negative impact. Mass tourism really doesn't generate money for communities, contrary to the fact that communities do embrace that form of tourism and don't seem to be able to think otherwise. But there are actually 5 principles of sustainable communities that have been more or less agreed upon by this sustainable development movement. And they are: enhance livability, create opportunities for economic prosperity, foster environmental responsibility, embrace design excellence, and demonstrate visionary leadership and strong governance. And I think that all of those principles and goals can be served through projects that put a focus on preserving and using cultural sites and heritage as regenerators of community life.
Great. Well, I think that unfortunately is we've come to the end of our time. I think that's a great place to stop, Bonnie, with those principles. I really appreciate the insights from our panelists. It's clear that with creative thinking, and I think with some facts and some case studies, we might be able to make a very strong case for creative thinking on how we can use market mechanisms combined with philanthropy and good policy to invest in heritage, and not only in the United States, but in other countries, to have this as part of the world recovery in this post-COVID world. I thank all of our panelists for joining. I thank you in the audience. As I said, we'll be posting this on the Antiquities Coalition website, and we welcome any further discussion that you might want to have, whether through Twitter or on our website. And we're happy to pass along any of those messages to our really excellent panelists. While we can't clap in the same way that we would, we do want to thank you so much for spending your hour with us and providing your insights. Thanks so much, Bonnie, Donovan, Richard.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.